This video is sponsored by War and Peace. Click the link in the description to fight epic Civil War battles today. The American project was nearly ripped in half during the US Civil War. The US nearly became two countries going on entirely different trajectories. This video exists to look at what would happen if the South did secede and what kind of country it would end up becoming. This is the cultural, economic, and social analysis of how the Confederacy would develop as a modern nation. The answers will surprise you. The Civil War may have ended more than 150 years ago, but you can keep fighting the most incredible battles today. This video is sponsored by War and Peace, a mobile real-time strategy game about the American Civil War. Create teams and form alliances with real other players in epic multiplayer combat. Focus on economic, military, and supply systems. It's a mobile real-time strategy game with base building and strategy and tactics. You can either play as the Confederacy with Jefferson Davis or the Union with Abraham Lincoln. Fight incredible and authentic Civil War battles with real weapons and artillery, including epic weapons like the Gatling gun and saber cavalry. Even fight real historic battles like Antietam or Gettysburg with special events. As a history buff, I love that there are different historic Civil War generals with different personalities, skills, and bonuses. Fight McClellan and never fight, or Winfield Scott, who is really getting on with his years, or Stonewall Jackson in all his strangeness. Click the link in the description to start fighting the epic battles of the Civil War with War and Peace today. This is not a what if the South won the Civil War alternate history. Well, it sort of is. However, this video gets to the heart of the issue of most what if the South won the Civil War alternate histories. I'll let you in on a little alternate history industry secret. There was no way an independent Confederacy could have survived more than 100 years. This was since the Confederacy was nearly able to win the Civil War by the quality of their leadership and some of the strengths that come from having a rural population like strong cavalry. However, once the tank and airplane got invented, the North would simply be able to outproduce the Confederacy and crush the South. The Union would hold the South's secession as an immense grudge and would want to retake it. The most plausible result is the Confederacy sides with the Entente in World War I, while the Union the Central Powers, with the Union reconquering the South during the First World War. Thus, if you decide to go down any realistic trajectory, the South just doesn't survive. For that reason, this video decides to not take a realistic trajectory. This video will start with the assumption that the South survives as a stable state up until the present. It will look at results just in America, mostly the American South, with looking a bit to the North to see how it would develop without the South attached. I understand you can't analyze anything in a vacuum, but this is a YouTube video, not a philosophy thesis statement, and so I choose to not get stuck too far down that rabbit hole. I'm really not going to focus on how the Confederacy would get independence in the first place. Let's say they win at either Antietam or Gettysburg and march on Washington. Britain and France decide to recognize the Confederacy while the pro-peace Democrats win the 1864 election. The Confederacy's borders are influenced a great deal by how they would win the war. Let's just go with the most likely option here, which is Kentucky goes for the Union, Oklahoma, where the native tribes fought with the Confederacy, goes with it, as does the southern half of Arizona and New Mexico, which was a Confederate territory. The Confederacy got into a mountain of debt to pay for the Civil War, considering paying taxes beneath their honor, basically ruining their currency. The Confederacy would spend the first decade after the war paying this off and creating a functioning fiscal state. The Confederacy, if it were to survive, would become a strong British ally. Much of their cotton went to British factories, and the British would look for a way to weaken the more powerful North. This would put the Confederacy in the same economic category as Commonwealth nations like Canada or Australia, or like Argentina and the rest of Latin America, which were economic dependencies of Britain at the time. These nations exchanged raw goods for British-produced ones. This would result in a major existential crisis for the Confederacy. This was in that the Confederacy was a nation founded upon slavery, and the British Empire in this era was profoundly against slavery, effectively ending it in much of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The British would continually pressure the Confederacy to end slavery. The Confederacy, as an economic dependency, would be forced to end slavery within several decades of independence. Similarly, as India would grow and become a bigger cotton producer across the 19th century, the South would lose negotiating power with Britain. This may sound like a bad thing for the plantation owners, and it would be to a certain extent, but there are ways of having all the pros of slavery without the cons. This is what happened with the Boers in South Africa, who, when the British forbade them from having slavery, created an apartheid system pretty close to it. In the system, workers needed their boss's permission to travel, and with blacks having barely any legal rights at all. The economic downside of slavery is you have to feed, clothe, and house slaves when you're not making money. In an industrialized society in which the market varies a great deal and there's a larger population, it's just cheaper to have barely paid wage labor in the good times and then fire them and let them starve during recessions. This is how cotton was produced with free labor after slavery in the American South in our world, India, and Egypt. The southern states desperately wanted to expand in the Caribbean before the Civil War in our timeline in order to find more space for plantations as they degraded the Deep South soil. This would occur in this timeline as they would be significantly more militarily powerful than any nation to the south of them. They would likely seize Cuba from Spain, several countries in Central America, and likely the north of Mexico as well. These regions would gain large settlements of Anglo and African Americans, who were going through a massive demographic expansion at this time. Northern Mexico and parts of Central America would be majority American. However, a certain part of the Hispanic population would survive, giving the Confederacy a certain Hispanic flair. The Confederate plantation-owning elite would see much of themselves in the native white Hispanic aristocracy, and the two would intermarry and exchange cultures. The Confederacy wouldn't be able to survive as a heavy states' rights nation. The need to maintain a military on par with the more populous and industrialized North and just raise taxes at all, or have a centralized currency, would demand it. A loose confederacy similar to modern Canada seems plausible. The whole idea that the Civil War was entirely about slavery is sort of facetious, since you can correlate the areas that joined the Confederacy with slave ownership. Multiple Confederate states wrote slavery and white supremacy as literal reasons for their rebellion, and the Southern states supported Dred Scott, or one of the most invasive actions of the central government ever, to support slavery. The South would only industrialize half-heartedly. This is for mostly cultural and systemic reasons. Slavery is a very capital-heavy industry in that you always need to buy more slaves, and thus slave owners were often in heavy amounts of debt. The American South was known for being dangerous for investors for said reason. This meant that the South's ability to raise capital was weak at best. At the same time, the decline in the price of cotton, caused by the opening up of Egypt and India as major cotton producers, would also lower the South's ability to raise capital. Similarly, Southern culture looked down upon industry and the like as dishonorable and ungentlemanly professions. Another variable is that most of the coastal areas of the South, or the easiest places to industrialize, are swampy and malarial. At the same time, however, the Confederacy would be way ahead of the curve by having stable property rights and rule of law. Similarly, British capital would flood the Confederacy for investments. The South, as an independent nation, would have slightly more industry than it did in our world in the late 19th century, with much of it likely clustered in either northern Virginia, close to the industrialized American Northeast, in Texas due to the oil industry, or in Atlanta, which is at the convergence of multiple rail networks. With less industry and thus opportunity, like in our timeline, the South would get less immigration than the North, missing out on the immigration of Jews, Italians, Irish, Germans, etc. This brings us to a major issue with this timeline: the rest of the world. We can either A, naively assume that things stay the same in much of the world, with the Nazis losing World War II and the Cold War, for example, or we can go with what happened in my What If the South Won the Civil War alternate history, which basically entails the Kaiser's Germany dominating Europe, Japan the Pacific, and the Ottoman Empire resurging. I choose to deal with the rest of the world by mostly ignoring it. What happened after World War I would likely happen in this timeline as well, which was the collapse of agricultural prices. What happened in Latin America would happen in the Confederacy as well, with a rapid reduction in standard of living and recession until World War II. The 20s and 30s would be brutal decades in the Confederacy. Perhaps blacks would launch guerrilla campaigns caused by a combination of their repression and poverty. This video isn't about the North, but I thought it was necessary to have a brief segment about it. I'm also here to debunk a major misconception people have about the North and South's relations, that the North was dependent upon the South. This is just blankly not true. This is evident in that during the Civil War, the North's economy boomed. For many of the mid-Atlantic states like Pennsylvania, it was a seminal moment in their industrialization. After the Civil War, the North's economy saw some of the greatest economic progress ever, while the South was a poor, war-ravaged wasteland. In other words, without the South, the North would do just fine, continuing to industrialize at breakneck speed. One of the major effects would be that the North would have practically no black population. With customs and border controls, the North would be able to control immigration and would almost certainly not want black immigrants from the Confederacy for most of the 20th century. This would have a profound effect upon music. Without the South glued into the North's industry and market, the history of music would be very different. Black-derived music like R&B, soul, gospel, rap, rock, or even white Southern genres like country would be much weaker, remaining local Confederate music forms. The North would also be significantly more socially left-wing, with the South acting as a conservative force on basically every social issue in American history. Similarly, more homogenous nations tend to have wider social programs, which would also apply to the North. The North's politics would have to be slightly right of modern-day Canada. The South would economically suffer in the 1920s and 30s, but would face an economic surgence in the years after World War II. This would happen for a variety of reasons, one of which would be the improvement of medical technology, thus rendering the material condition of much of the South null. Secondly, air conditioning, which would make much more of the South habitable. This was part of a massive surge of traditionally poorer nations becoming wealthier in the years after World War II. As global capital surged across areas like Ireland, South Korea, and Eastern Europe, all of which saw massive surges in their wealth, the South would be part of this category. Exactly like our timeline, businesses would relocate to the American South for cheaper wages. The South would likely be a certain degree poorer than our timeline for several reasons. The first of which is that it wouldn't be glued into the US's massive market, and business would have to be done across a border. Secondly, education standards would be worse in the South. The North forced public education down the South's throat after the Civil War. The North and South carry very different values of education for reasons going back to the British settlers which arrived in the 17th century in each region. Even today, the southern states have the worst educational standards of any states in the Union. Without being part of the same nation as the North, the Confederacy would have worse education. However, without Yankee ideas like welfare, the South could lower their costs of operating and make themselves even more attractive to foreign business, eventually acting in a similar role to what Eastern Europe has done over the last 30 years. Culturally, the Confederacy would be very interesting. Class had far more importance in the South than it did in the North. Thus, the wealthy classes of Virginia and the Deep South would control culture until the second half of the 20th century, when the poorer whites would become wealthy enough to determine culture. In the earlier era, Confederate culture would ape traditional Europe, which was the upper class's style, while the radio and TV announcers would have thick Tidewater accents. As the lower classes would get more power and the middle classes would grow, country music and rodeo would become more of national icons, while more TV announcers would talk like they were from Tennessee or Arkansas. Race is a very difficult question to figure out. In all real terms, the South has done an admirable job of dealing with race since Jim Crow. It annoys me when people describe the South today as some bastion of racism, as by both objective standards and my own personal experience of traveling across America, that's just not true. However, much of this progress happened by ending Jim Crow, which was forced down the South's throat by the North. Without the North, the South would end Jim Crow in the 80s at least. In general, the South's attitude towards race is determined by the world around them. If we're in a similar timeline to ours generally, with the Nazis losing World War II, colonialism ending, and racism being abhorred, the Confederacy would follow a path pretty similar to our South Africa, ending apartheid in the 90s, except with a white majority. If we're in a world with the Kaiser's Germany victorious and European colonies stretching across Africa, Jim Crow would survive until the present. We often view the decline of racism as a natural progression of the moral arc of history, while it is more likely a reaction to the Nazis. Almost all of history is deeply racist, or at least very ethnocentric, and if you leave the most comfortable parts of the world, it's still very much the case. White supremacy would sadly thrive in the South in this sort of world. What if Altist, and thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please like, comment, subscribe, or stay tuned for additional content. Or alternatively, check me out on Twitter or on my Patreon, where I've got all sorts of cool maps, as well as the first 8 chapters of my history of the world. As always, thanks so much for watching and have a great day.